But next year, January, going to the Philippines, and after that, hopefully Vietnam, maybe Indonesia.
1 year ago. Yeah, around Christmas. That's right. That was. I was there when they were electing the mayors of Taipei and Taiwan.
I'd like to welcome all of you here today. My name is Joseph Wong. I'm a professor in the Political Science Department here at the University of Toronto. This event today on the Taiwan presidential elections is being co-hosted, co-sponsored by the Asian Institute, Department of East Asian Studies here at UoT, as well as Political Science. As you are all well aware, these last elections represent a particularly important moment in Taiwan, as well a particularly important moment with implications that I think are quite far-reaching in terms of international relations, particularly with respect to the triangular relationship of Taiwan, PRC, and primarily the United States, although also in some regards Canada as well. And it's also an extremely important moment in terms of the future of democracy in Asia. I was in Taiwan during the elections, after which time I then went to South Korea for a conference, the other presidency in crisis, and there was a tremendous amount of talk about the future of democracy in Asia. In fact, South Koreans are very pleased about what happened in Taiwan because it's taken a lot of media attention away from their own impeachment crisis. We're very fortunate today to have a panel of speakers, and I'll just briefly introduce them to you. To my far left is Michael Stainton from the York Center for Asian Research and a specialist in Taiwan politics. Bernie Frolick, who is Professor Emeritus at York University and visiting scholar here at the Munk Center at the University of Toronto. To my right, Victor Falkenheim, who is a faculty member in the Department of East Asian Studies, as well as in political science. Both Bernie and Victor are experts in Chinese politics. The format of today's roundtable is really quite simple. What we're going to do is each of us is going to speak for about 10 minutes to sort of lay out some of the key issues that we think have emerged out of the presidential elections in Taiwan. But what we want is we would like to have a larger discussion. So we're really thinking of ourselves as the vehicle for laying out these issues and then opening it up to the floor. And what we'll do is we'll take questions and comments in groups, and then the panel can respond to them as they see fit. So I'm going to go first, and I'm really going to sort of give a lay of the land here, and then talk about these elections in the context of democratic consolidation. As you all know, on March 20th, we had the third elections for the presidency in Taiwan. As well that day, there was also an important referendum wherein two questions were asked to the Taiwanese people. The referendum failed. Only 45% of those able to vote participated in the referendum. According to the referendum law, you need a 50% voting turnout rate in order to reach a quorum. However, for those who did respond to the referendum question, about 85% agreed with both questions, one in terms of military defense and the other in terms of negotiations with China. With respect to the elections, this is a little bit more difficult. I guess in some respects it would have been better if we had this or held this event a little later on when the picture became a little clearer. The elections, as you well know, is still ongoing. This is what we know. On the day of the elections, we had an 80% voter turnout rate, which was, by at least Western standards, extremely high. The Pan-Blue camp, Chen Shui-bian, won 50.11% of the votes. So it's not 50 plus 1, it's really 50 plus 0.1 can get you the presidency. The Lian Song camp in the Pan-Blue camp took 49.89%, a difference of about 30,000 votes. There was actually, I remember I was at TVBS watching the exit poll and watching all of the polling, and there was actually a time when about 70% of polls reporting, and the difference was about 200 votes between the candidates. So this was extremely, extremely close. Thirdly, we also know that there are about 337,000 invalid ballots, which represents about 2.5%. The Liansong camp, of course, have now argued and are seeking a recount of the votes. They've launched 2 suits. One is to seek a recount of the votes, and one also to annul the election results. They've given a whole list of reasons, anywhere ranging between 4 and 11, depending on what newspaper you're reading. Their primary causes for concern, of course, are what they see to be the mysterious circumstances surrounding the assassination attempt on March 19th. I actually arrived in Taiwan on March 19th, and I took a nap at around 1 o'clock, and I woke up to the local news thinking, gosh, my Chinese has gotten quite bad. It says that Chen Shui-bian has been shot. Indeed, my Chinese wasn't bad, and he had been shot. The second cause for concern amongst the Pan-Blue supporters is the what they claim to be the inability of a large section of military personnel from voting on the day of the election. Third is the alarmingly large number of invalid ballots. And fourth, a whole host of irregularities that they've cited. Essentially, and it is quite tragically ironic that the KMT, the chairman of the KMT, has been quoted as saying that, making charges that it's unfair that the ruling party should use dirty tricks to win elections. I say it's tragically ironic because he's the leader of the KMT. In terms of winning and losing, the real winner, the academic rhetorical device is always to say the real winner is Taiwan's democracy. Although I think that is still up for debate, and we're going to talk about that today. The real winner in terms of actual numbers, I would suggest to you, is the Pan-Green camp. According to the 2000 election results, Chen Shui-bian took 39% of the vote, James Song 37%, and Dan Zhan 23%, which clearly shows that in order for Chen Shui-bian to have won these elections, he really had quite a bit of ground to make up. And in fact, the polls, at least the official polls prior to the elections, showed that at one point, in fact, President Chen was behind in the polls by about 20%. As we got closer to the election, particularly after the large 228 rally, the polls had narrowed, but still showed the KMT to likely win the presidential election, or the Pan-Blue camp to likely win the elections by about 8 to 10%. In fact, sources of mine within the DPP recounted to me that on the morning of the elections, they were really ready to concede defeat. It was inconceivable for many of them that Chen Shui-bian would be able to win. I say the real winner is the Pan-Green camp because they really did narrow the gap. And they really did narrow the gap, particularly in the north, which is a geographical area that is not typically associated as being a DPP stronghold. Of course, the KMT, or the Pan-Blue camp, did win most of the northern region, but the margin by which they won was considerably less so than in years past. And in fact, as well, with respect to the recount issue, it's in my opinion that even with a recount, the Pan-Green camp will still win. If any of you, for those of you who have participated in these international observer delegations, know that the vote counting process is painstakingly slow, seems to be inefficient. Every ballot is held up, read out loud. Party representatives from all contending parties are there, checked, before the actual ballot is then checked. So it's at least from my opinion, it's inconceivable how anyone can make up 30,000 votes as a result of a recount. In terms of actual data, this is still unavailable to us. There are many exit polling outfits in Taiwan, and the data is yet to come out in any meaningful form. So it's very difficult for us to actually get a sense of how to explain these election results, but I'll offer some speculative thoughts as to how the Pan-Green won. One reason we see the Pan-Green camp winning is, in many respects, of course, money politics continues to exist in Taiwan, to be sure. As of March 18th, 2,000 counts of vote buying had been reported to the Ministry of Justice, which is not insignificant, although in the context of Taiwanese democratic politics, much better than in the past. And so for many people then, they see the decline of money politics as being correlated with the decline of KMT factional politics at the local level and the ability of the KMT to garner votes through the factional networks at the local level. The second reason why it looks as though the Greens won was because of the large number of invalid ballots. It's believed that a significant portion of these invalid ballots would have gone to the Pan-Blue camp. Third is the referendum issue. Sources in the TPP tell me that really the referendum issue was used by the DPP in order to mobilize its base. That it was an election device, an election strategy to mobilize the Pan-Green base. And with the hopes of, and I think quite successfully as well, fragmenting the Pan-Blue. And as we know, there was a tremendous amount of conflict within the Pan-Blue camp about the legality of the referendum itself. Song and Lien were quite clear in not taking a ballot. Ma Ying-jeou, who was believed to be the successor in terms of the KMT leadership, was much more secretive about this. So we can see that there's very little consensus within the KMT as to the legality of the referendum issue. Again, as a mobilizing device, it was extremely helpful to the Chen Shui-bian camp. And fourth, the shooting and the assassination attempt of March 19th. And we can discuss the veracity of the assassination attempt and all of the corresponding conspiracy theories that have emerged subsequent. But the shooting did matter. It mattered in two ways. In one way, it did, I think, garner and gain the DPP sympathy votes, votes for Chen Shui-bian. As well, and the KMT and the Pan-Blue camp is a little less willing to recognize this, their reaction to the shooting, particularly the comments made by Sissy Chen, really, I think, turned the minds of some of the middle voters in Taiwan. That they were just not at all pleased with the reaction of the KMT, that it was viewed as inappropriate. And there is a large number of middle voters in Taiwan that could have swung either way. And I think that this was, the reaction of the KMT was one such factor that had them swing towards the Chen Shui-bian camp. Of course, then, we also have to ask how the Blues lost this election. Going into the election, most observers, in fact, at a dinner before the election, there were nine of us, and we went around the table predicting who would win the election. 6 out of 9 of us thought the KMT would win. Certainly the polls showed that to be the case, so it's, I think, very fitting to ask, how did the Blues lose this? I think in one respect, there was a tremendous amount of overconfidence on the part of the Pan Blues, which led to a less strategic electoral campaign. In many ways, and they've in fact cited this over and over and over again, they assumed that the sum of the votes for Lian Zhan and James Song from the 2000 election should equal presidential victory for the Lian Song ticket. I think in many ways the Song supporters were there. I think the Song supporters are either in love with James Song the person or hold to a particular ideology, political ideology that Song appeals to. I think, however, that Lian Zhan's support base was always weak, particularly after the KMT's defeat for all intents and purposes during the legislative elections of 2001. So there were a lot of supporters that had supported Lian Zhan in 2000 that could have swung towards the DPP. Second reason why the Blues lost, I think, is because the alliance between James Song and Lian Zhan was odd to begin with. And it became apparent to many Taiwanese voters that the future governance of Taiwan might be threatened through this rather odd alliance of two presidential or former presidential candidates who, for all intents and purposes, don't like each other. Third reason is the KMT, because of their overconfidence, some would even say arrogance, failed to control the agenda during the elections. Really, it was the DPP who dominated the political agenda throughout the election campaign. The DPP was able to take many of the issues. The KMT demonstrated little policy originality. With respect to the economy, which was one way in which we had expected the KMT to go after the Chen Shui-bian administration, Again, there was very little by way of original policy solutions that the KMT was suggesting. The rhetoric that was spun out of the KMT camp was largely that the Chen Shui-bian administration is just simply incapable, and that the KMT has demonstrated over the last 45, 50 years that it is indeed capable of managing the economy. Last thing that I want to talk about is this notion of democratic crisis. I mean, I do research on democratization in Asia, and one of the main questions that have emerged out of these elections is democracy in crisis in Taiwan. Is it, as Song and Lian supporters demonstrated on last Saturday, is democracy dead, as they have suggested in some of their placards? Certainly, if one reads the Beijing press, the Singaporean Straits Times, even some of the Hong Kong news, much of the writing and editorializing suggests that democracy in Taiwan is problematic, democracy in Asia is potentially problematic, and that in fact what we've seen in Taiwan is tremendous polarization. I would suggest, and I'm going to put this argument out on the table, that this is not a crisis at all. That democracy is not dead. That the processes of democratic consolidation are continuing to develop unabated in Taiwan, and for several reasons. One, for the most part, the resolution of this particular crisis is being played out by the rules of the game. In fact, and in many ways, some might say that Chen Shui-bian has adhered to the rules of the game in order to frustrate the KMT, who is essentially demanding that the president, by executive order a recount immediately. But the process is being played out according to the rules of the game. Second of all, these sorts of bumps in the road are part and parcel of all processes of democratic consolidation. One of the things that we have learned, in fact, if one thinks of democratization as a continually learning process, one of the things that we've learned, quite simply, is that in close elections, you have to have some rules that accommodate these close results, and this is what they're doing now. This is what they're working on, and again, this is part and parcel of the process of democratic learning and democratic consolidation, and they're making new institutions, hopefully, to ensure that this type of crisis won't happen again. Thirdly, I really don't see this as polarizing as the popular media, both in Asia and abroad, would suggest. That in fact, there's a tremendously large middle voting base in Taiwan that has been relatively silent about this. In talking to the layperson in Taiwan, most people are saying, look, the elections are over, and it's now time to look forward to the next election and remobilize. I think that really is the consensus view amongst a very large portion of voters in Taiwan. And what we're seeing on television is really a marginal base, is really an extreme base, one that's extremely well mobilized, one that is extremely angry, but one that is not part of the middle voter. So I really don't see this as tremendously polarizing and of crisis proportions. Does not mean, however, that there are no challenges ahead and challenges inherent to all politics of democratic consolidation. Challenges for both the Pan Blue and Pan Green. I'll start with the Pan Blue. I think the Pan Blue has really handled this quite poorly. Dian Zhan made his announcements and his proclamations before even the election results were formally announced, which was not insignificant in the minds of many Taiwanese voters, and this has led many to interpret these actions as being whiny and sour grapes. Second of all, in this hastiness, the Pan Blue camp has also launched, I think, two quite contradictory civil suits, or two quite contradictory suits. One demanding a recount and one demanding the nullification of the election results. I was at a press conference in Taiwan, and one of the international media people asked, you've asked for both a recount and an annulment of the election results. In the event that in the recount you do win, are you still going to ask for an annulment of the election results? To which there was no clear answer. The answer was largely scripted. Thirdly, I think the KMT has really incited and mobilized the extremes. And as a result, in thinking about looking towards the future, they're really beginning to alienate the middle voter. There is word on the street that if elections were held again, that the Chen Shui-bian camp, the Pan Green camp, would actually win quite handily. They're losing a lot of support in the middle, and they're And lastly, I think they've put Ma Ying-jeou in a horrible, horrible position. Ma Ying-jeou is really viewed, and I think quite rightly, as the next leader of the KMT and the Pan-Blue camp, as both the mayor of Taipei right now and also vice chairman of the party. He's in an extremely tough position in terms of how he handles how he handled the protests. In fact, inciting some, whoops and hollers against him, which could not do anything good for the KMT. In my mind, the KMT, I think that any democracy requires strong political parties. The Pan-Blue camp must remain strong in order for this to be a vibrant democracy, and they really should be focused on the future legislative UN elections in December. For the DPP, major challenges are ahead as well. The most important one, I think, is what does President Chen Shui-bian really think? And this is extremely important. In the first 2 years of his term, he came out with, I think, quite a moderate, pragmatic policy position. In the last 2 years of his first term, he came out with a much more aggressive position. It was interpreted by many that he took on this much more aggressive position in order to mobilize votes and to mobilize for the election and the referendum, leading many of us to suspect or to think that after having won the election, that he would kind of pull back on some of these issues, the most important of which, of course, is the Constitution that he wants to promulgate by 2008 and pass by referendum in 2006. I myself thought that this was something that he wouldn't be pushing any further. Word from on high, people who have spoken to Chen and who I've been able to needle information from, have said that no, he's actually quite resolute in pushing for this particular policy. And this may, of course, serve to polarize and exacerbate tensions across the strait. The most important thing, I think, however, for the DPP in understanding what Chen Shui-bian really thinks is that in the past, and my colleagues can correct me because I'm sure I'm wrong, but from what I understand, in the past, the triangular relationship between Beijing, Taipei, and Washington has largely been contingent upon the actions of Beijing and DC. For the first time, however, it seems now that the actions of Taipei are going to matter. And in this regard, I think that greater transparency in terms of what Chen Shui-bian really thinks is absolutely crucial, because these signals that are being sent then across to DC and across the straits of the PRC, I think will matter. So let me just leave it at that, and we'll pass it on to Michael Staten to provide us with some comments.
Gee, that was a long 2 minutes.
I'm sorry.
Joe's said a lot of things that I was going to say, so I'll drop them, and that's all right because we can get on to some more interesting things. I think Joe skirted around two of the most interesting things. You didn't say them explicitly, although they were all there, so I'll do that. The first thing is I think the reason that the election turned out the way it did, and it's not so much a matter of who won or who lost, but what the voting trends have been over the past 8 years, is that this election was about who loves Taiwan more. It was really an election about loving Taiwan. And of course, as Joe pointed out, that was the point of making the referendum the centerpiece of the election campaign, because the referendum essentially forced the blue camp to either say, well, either we love Taiwan or we don't, and so the blue camp basically had to say, well, just boycott it, don't vote on the referendum at all. So I'll pass these around. Myra brought these back from Taiwan. There's a wonderful piece of how could you fail to love Taiwan when the appeal comes in this form. And of course the other thing was the whole election was, as Joe correctly pointed out, the Green camp basically defined the terms of the election from the beginning, and the KMT never did have a chance of seeing the issue. Was basically defined in terms of is it Taiwan or China? So even here, they make a nice thing. Taiwan is on the right, and all your votes should be on the right of the ballot. And the alternative, you know what the alternative is here. So and a little thing telling people how to vote, the complicated procedure with the referendum, and of course just to make the point, the alternative was here on the other side too. So. The other thing was that the Love Taiwan was also means redefining what Taiwan is, and I think we tend to forget that just 11 years ago, the KMT under Li Danghui at that time had begun to say, well, the Republic of China is a sovereign country, and this was the beginning of the so-called Guodu. But in that same year, the DPP had presented a large policy paper, ironically under Xu Xinliang, who ended up supporting the Blue Camp in this election, emphasizing that Taiwan was a multicultural, multi-ethnic nation and not simply a branch plant of China. And so, the 228 Hu Taiwan human chain from north to south emphasized the multi-ethnic nature of Taiwan. This is one of the little headbands they passed out. And in the whole human chain, they emphasized this multi-ethnic nature of Taiwan too, by having the chain beginning with people standing in the sea in Geelong, were Dao Aboriginal people, and at the end of the chain in the south in Pingtung also were Taiwan Aboriginal people. So emphasizing the multi-ethnic nature of Taiwan as a contrast to China. So you can pass that around and you do a cartoon of all the different supposedly ethnic groups in Taiwan. And so the high point of the DPP, or we should say the Green Campaign, because of course it was both the DPP and Li Danghui with his now Li Danghui KMT, or Taiwan Solidarity Alliance, against the Blues, was this 228 human chain, defend Taiwan human chain from north to the south. An incredibly emotional and theatrical event. Sort of a patriotic love fest, but of course this was also the high point of their election campaign. A week later, the KMT also mobilized approximately 2 million people for their final rallies, but as Joe pointed out, they really didn't have a central theme for this rally. It was just change the president and save Taiwan, which was really a pretty weak sort of slogan. And in the end, of course, both Lin and Sung had to literally kneel to the DPP campaign and kneel down and kiss the ground to show that they love Taiwan too. Really, of course, I'm not neutral in these matters. I've always been a fan of the DPP. But I mean, even in the fall, when Chen Shui-bian was way behind in the polls, I was still quite confidently saying the DPP will win, because the election isn't going to be about the economy or about the legislative program or anything else. It's going to be about who loves Taiwan more, and in the end, the DPP will win on that, and they certainly did. The high voting rate in Taiwan, 76% in '96, 82% in 2000, and 80% in 2004. I would say is linked to this fact that elections are essentially an expression of love for Taiwan. Interestingly enough, the lowest turnout in the election in Taiwan in terms of percentage was in the part of the Republic of China which is not Taiwan. On Jinmen and Matsu, the voter turnout was only 64%. Now you could say part of that is due to the remoteness of the islands and people not going back to vote. Nonetheless, the opposite is also true. Where was the highest turnout? 84% in the two townships which were Abian country, Chaotou and in Kaohsiung County, and Mado, both of which were historically the site of a number of very significant anti-KMT incidents dating back to the 1940s, when the KMT arrested an entire high school class in Mado and threw them on the Green Island for 40 years. So 84% in Abian County voted, 64% in Chinese country in Jinmen and Matsu. So we can say that elections in Taiwan certainly are an expression of a very vibrant democracy, but they're also a communal mass affirmations of Taiwanese identity, almost a religious, in a Durkheimian sense, of a religious sense of society worshipping itself. And so you see this in the mass assemblies, 2 million people in these huge rallies from around the island for both parties. The last weekend, the DPP had 500,000 to 600,000 people in Kaohsiung alone in its big rally. After the election, the Blue Camp had up to 500,000 people on Katagalan Boulevard in the north. Perhaps up to, depending on how many came back from China, which you really don't know, up to 100,000 Taiwanese came back from North America and other places to vote in the election. Of course, they weren't paid to do this. They paid their own good money to go back and vote and work to express their love for Taiwan. And the extremely totalizing nature of these elections is also expressed in this new disease which they have in Taiwan called electionitis, where people are going to the doctors and asking for tranquilizers to get them through, literally, to get them through the fever of the election. The one paper reported that there were perhaps 2 million cases of family conflict, because within families people were supporting different sides, and husbands and wives weren't speaking to one another. That even after the election there were suicides because of the Blue Camp losing the election. So elections are more than a democratic process in Taiwan. They are an almost religious mass assembly affirming Taiwanese identity. And this is really why elections are so threatening to China in Taiwan. They're not just elections which threaten China from the perspective of democracy. They are affirmations of Taiwan's non-Chinese identity. Well, Joe mentioned some of the voting trends, and just to review that again, since 1996, the Blue Camp total vote has dropped by over 2 million votes, and that's out of 13 million people who vote in approximately each election. And of course, the green side has gone up by also well over 2 million votes. So that even if the DPP had lost the election, which was possible, they essentially have won because they have continued to steamroll ahead in terms of the popular vote. And as Joe also pointed out, they didn't just win in the south, they also took large bites out of the KMT support in traditional KMT areas. So, for instance, in Taipei City, since 1996, the KMT vote, and I'm talking here in terms of all the Pan-Blue, so in 1996 that includes Li Danghui, Lin Yanggang, and Chen Luan, who also supported the blue side in this election. The blue vote went from 75% in 1996 to 61% in 2000 to 56% in 2004, and the DPP vote went up conversely. In Kaohsiung, which we now see is a DPP stronghold, but it wasn't. In 1996, the Blue Camp got 72% of the vote, dropped to 54% in 2000 and to 44% in 2004. And then to look at two KMT strongholds, one where vote buying is still very much a common practice, Taidong County, where I lived and watched vote buying through a number of elections. In 1996, the Blues got 86%, 2000 dropped to 76%, and 2004 dropped another 10% to 65%. In Hsinchu County, seen as a blue stronghold because of the Hakka vote, also in 1996, the Blues got 89% of the vote. In 2000, it dropped to 72%, and in 2004, it's dropped to 64%. So, even in what I really specialize in Taiwan politics is Aboriginal politics, this little 2% minority. And in fact, in looking at the election results, both in terms of turnout and the distribution of the vote, as well as my own fieldwork and experience in Taiwan over the years, I could say that the KMT is still actively practicing vote buying in Aboriginal rural communities. And that's because in a rural Aboriginal community, it's a low risk activity. You're not likely to get turned in as you would, say, in the Taiwanese community, because the frontline vote buyers are your neighbors, your friends, and your relatives in these small communities. So you're not going to turn them in, because everybody in the community, I watched the elections in 1998, everybody said, well, you know, these elections, once they're passed, we're still all going to have to live together in this community, so let's not ruin the Heqi, or a village, over the election. So I actually accompanied one of the KMT guys that night when he was going around passing out the money, and I didn't turn him in either, because he was a nice guy and he was poor and he needed the money. Vote buying in a number of poor Aboriginal townships clearly went on a large scale, because the KMT was still getting things like 93, 92, 91% of the vote in some of these small rural and poor townships. Nonetheless, even within the Aboriginal vote, the average KMT vote, the average DPP vote, which was 13% in 2000, in the north, in Aboriginal townships in the north of Taiwan, has gone up to 20%. Even in the east coast, which is the worst area of Taiwan in terms of vote buying, the DPP vote in Aboriginal townships was 8% in 2000, and it's crawled up to 12% in 2004. So the Greens win the elections, and I assume they'll continue to win elections. And so I wanted to point out some amazing facts about the referendum, because the referendum was a big thing in this election. Indeed, the referendum was a way of mobilizing voters, and it apparently was successful even more than the DPP had anticipated, despite the call for a boycott by much of the blue camp, because 620,000 more people voted in the referendum than actually voted for Chen Shui-bian, which means a lot of KMT or blue supporters decided to vote for the referendum. We assumed that a lot of the no votes would be blue supporters, but in fact, in the referendum number 1, there were still 30,000 more voters who voted yes in the referendum than voted for Chen Shui-bian, even in things like Tainan County, his own home territory, which shows that a lot of the so-called Bantu Pai, the Taiwan KMT people, for instance, represented by Wang Jinping, voted in the referendum and voted yes on these questions. The other interesting thing about the referendum, which I find to be a bit of a mystery, was 250,000 less people voted on the second question than on the first question. Even though, as you see, the ballot there was pretty, just tick off 1, 2. Was this because the first question was something which people with a Taiwan consciousness could pretty much all agree on? Yes, we need to increase national defense spending against China. Whereas the second question could go either way. Well, do you authorize the government to have talks with China? Perhaps a lot of very patriotic Taiwanese would say, no, we don't want to talk with China at all. And so they just didn't bother to vote in the second referendum. I don't know. But it's a bit of a mystery. Why would 250,000 people less vote on referendum question number 2 than voted on question number 1? Now, also on the referendum, again, Jinmen and Matsu were the exception. More people, in fact, over twice as many people on Jinmen and Matsu voted for Chen Shui-bian than even voted in the referendum, which I found really funny, because that's not Chen Shui-bian territory at all. And another interesting thing about the vote in Jinmen and Matsu was that the highest rate of invalid ballots was also in Jinmen and Matsu, 3.25%. Now, invalid voting in Taiwan has always run about 9 to 1.2%, although in some areas, I was looking back at some of my records, in the legislative election in Taitung County in 1994, it actually was an 8% invalid voting rate, perhaps because of the complexity of the ballot. So the invalid vote is something we might discuss, and I've actually have a little handout here. I only have a few of them for people who are interested, my take on the invalid vote. But for the purpose of discussion, I'll throw out a few predictions and end up with some predictions about Taiwan and China, which I know is concern for this seminar. First of all, the DPP, allied with the Taiwan Solidarity Alliance, can certainly gain a majority in the legislative elections, which are coming up in December, and so the campaign has already started. Until then, the deadlock in the legislature and wrangling will continue. And of course, one reason is because the Blue Camp cannot run a joint campaign for the legislature. Sung is going to have to run his candidates, and the KMT are going to have to run their candidates against one another. Secondly, Len Jian will certainly be stepping down and joining the other people who have incurred the displeasure of Li Denghui in the retirement home, Lin Yanggang and Hao Bo-chun. So now the interesting question is who will succeed him, and in what way. And it looks like Ma Ying-jeou will succeed him, and Ma actually came out looking very good last Sunday, because up until Sunday nobody really knew what the Blue Camp wanted. As Joe pointed out, they want the election annulled, they want a recount, they want a judicial recount. No, the judiciary isn't any good. We want an administrative recount. No, that's no good either. We want the president to declare a state of emergency, and so on and so on and so on. And it was only Sunday afternoon that Ma Ying-jeou finally brought this mass demonstration to a close by, for the first time, very clearly and unequivocally announcing we have two demands. One, we want a complete recount. Secondly, we want a full investigation of the shooting incident. And third, we will accept the result of a recount, which was one of Chen's demands for agreeing to a recount, which would mean that they could have a judicial recount without having to go through a long court case. And it was Ma then who announced, everybody should go home, and basically everybody except 300 diehards did go home at the end of the day. So the big question now is, what is Sung's strategy? Basically, Sung and Ma are both essentially mainlanders. If Ma Ying-jeou becomes the leader of the KMT, then Sung Chu-yu vote base for his party and his hopes for another presidential run, and he's young enough to do it again in 4 years, are threatened. So I think one of the reasons for the continuing demonstrations and a certain amount of chaos in the streets is the fact that Sung Chu-yu is that Len Jian didn't want to retire, and the only way you can keep the long knives from coming out is to keeping everybody focused on the opposition, instead of saying, hey, you've lost 2 elections in a row, maybe it's time, to give up. But Sung Chu-yu would really have an interest in continuing chaos as well. If you continue to polarize the vote, the Bantu Pai of the KMT are going to drift over towards Li Denghui's Taiwan Solidarity Alliance. Other hardliners are going to decide that the KMT really doesn't have the guts to stand up and fight the way they need to fight, and so they're going to drift over to Sung Chu. So is Sung's policy going to be to try to unite the right under his leadership and try to unite both parties under him? Or is it going to be to try to bleed the KMT to death by continuing to create a certain amount of chaos on the streets, which keeps everybody worked up and keeps everybody angry and eventually polarizes things so that the KMT itself continues to bleed members in both directions? So that's the real story to watch, I think. On the post-election dispute, I agree with Joe. The recount will confirm that Chen has won the election. If the shooting case is solved, and it may not be, after all, other political shootings in Taiwan have not been solved either over 20 years, I predict it will be linked to the gambling rings, the criminal gangs who are running huge gambling operations on the outcome of the election. So this won't make any difference even if there is a final solution to the shooting, because it won't stop conspiracy theorists any more than the Warren Commission stopped conspiracy theories in the United States. On Taiwan and China, did China really want the Blues to win the election? essentially there is no difference between Chen Shui-bian's position and Lin Jian's position. Lin Jian also said, you know, the ROC is an independent sovereign country. We will never talk with China except on the basis of equality. Unacceptable to China. Lin also said, oh, we want a new constitution too, and in fact even said that Chen's proposal was actually was wuliao, was meaningless, and we'll even have a better new constitution. So China might have improved atmospherics for a few months with a blue administration, but essentially the fundamentals are no different with the KMT in power than they would be with the DPP in power. And does China perhaps prefer to have a DPP regime because that means that Taiwan would be seen more of a naughty child, and China can have more chance of dividing the United States from Taiwan? So I'll leave it with that question.
Okay, I'll address that last point shortly. I'm not sure I quite agree with it, but about China's position on the blues. But thank you very much. My task here is to talk about the other participants in the Taiwan election, that is China and the United States and Canada. That's what I was tasked to do. So I don't know where Canada yet fits in, but let's talk about China and the United States. I think the election was all about China. I mean, I think that seems to be the way the election moved. And of course, we thought there'd be other issues, the economy, the management of the state by the DPP, criticism of that, its capacity to govern. In the process, what you get is an affirmation of Taiwan nationalism, suddenly emerged in this election very clearly as a key factor. And we have a reaffirmation, I think, if we agree with Joe's analysis, that of the democratic process and the institutionalization of democracy in Taiwan, if things proceed the way they seem to be on course now. I think it's all about China, and let me just run through China's position very quickly, what little we can glean from this, and then look at the American position, and then throw it open later for discussion. I think the Chinese position was we're going to wait for the election. This has already been for some time. If you notice, their position on Taiwan has been fairly muted the last couple of years, in particular in policy statements and documents. They haven't been pushing the button. They haven't been concerned, at least the rhetoric hasn't escalated to the extent that Chen Shui-bian's rhetoric escalated on independence. In visits to China and talking with Chinese scholars and some officials who don't really want to talk about Taiwan anyway, the Pan Blue, they assumed the Pan Blue would win. And if that happened, they would be able to have some chance to get back, negotiate. Perhaps the strategy might change somewhat, although difficult on the Chinese side. So I think that's an important point. There were some Chinese who said, be very careful, don't assume anything about the Pan Blue winning, because nationalism is a very powerful tool, and the DPP will play the nationalism card. That was told to me last year by a number of Chinese Taiwan experts. Other people in China said, it's okay, the economy will help us. The increased interdependence between China and Taiwan is working to China's favor. It's going to make it easier for people to support us because it's in Taiwan's interest to develop closer links with China. This is a positive aspect. Okay, that's the first point. Secondly, they did then begin to put, once the referendum was brought out on the table, they began to put pressure on Chen not to proceed with the referendum and to water it down. And ultimately it was watered down. Whether they consider that to be a victory or not, the fact is it did happen with American support. The third, to remind Taiwan that China will not accept Taiwanese independence, and it will not renounce the use of force in order to maintain the position that Taiwan is part of China, and to compromise China's sovereignty. That remained constant, but it wasn't done in a shrill way or in an excitable way. It was just there regularly, drip, drip, drip. It was always there. The fourth is that they will provide quiet support to the Pan Blues. And they did it in such a way that they wouldn't be seen as being compromised in the election. For example, apparently the Pan Blue had an office, the KMT had an office in Shanghai during the election where they could help mobilize the between 500,000 and, well, at least 500,000 around Shanghai and maybe 1.5 million in China, mobilize as many of those who could get back to China to vote, because you can't vote in the Taiwan election from outside China. So they allowed that office to be there. They also, from what I gather, helped to mobilize, give support, get these people to the transportation facility so they can get to vote in the mainland, to vote in Taiwan. So there was some quiet support, but it was very carefully managed. The Chinese lobbied with the Americans to step in and mediate with the Chinese, with the Taiwanese. This is the first time there's been a public, in a sense, statement that this did happen. There may have been mediation attempts before by the Americans, and I think we know of some of them, or there are some of them, but this was always done out of the public eye. This is the first time it was clearly seen as a publicly initiative that the public, enough people were aware of. This happened, at least we know for sure, in February. When Secretary Powell shook hands with Chen Shui-bian, sometime, I can't remember when that was, that was an interesting event, because while the Chinese were upset about it, they weren't that upset about it. They let it go, ultimately, with some mild protests. And that's interesting, too, because in the past that probably would not have happened. So the Chinese maintained a low-key approach to the election. There were no splits in the Chinese position, unlike in the mid-90s when people argued there were hawks that wanted to shoot missiles and did shoot missiles across the strait and so forth. This time, you couldn't really get a sense of any particular dispute within China on this. It was a low-key position. There were no saber rattling, no missiles. There was some concern. Some Chinese complained that the slogan in the election that the DPP put forward, that a vote for Lianzhan is a vote for China, and a vote for Abian is a vote for Taiwan, was unfortunate, and they didn't like it. But it was difficult to get around that, and that was an important issue. Now, another issue that may have had some effect, and we don't know, and I don't know, I'm just throwing it out, is the Hong Kong situation. The Chinese, it's a problem for China when 500,000 people demonstrate against the policies of the Chinese government, as of last summer, when other organized groups move to confront the Chinese government, they can deal with it more directly, such as Falun Gong and so forth. In this case, they've been trying to manage the Hong Kong situation a little more cautiously within the one country, two systems solution. In part, I think, because of this election, they sort of held off, moving more strongly to try to control the push for democracy in Hong Kong. But they want to do it quietly because they didn't want to jeopardize the election, a perception that, look what the Chinese did, look what the PRC does in Hong Kong. This is more reason to not to vote to be with China. And I think perhaps, I have to wait and see, even with the Dalai Lama's recent statements and visits coming up, Chinese position had been relatively muted, again, so there wouldn't be any place to criticize China. China has its own agendas, its own problems, and as I said, I think it was waiting to see what would happen at the time of the election. Now, since the election, they've been restrained. There was a delayed reaction. Then there was satisfaction, small consolation that the referendum hadn't passed. They said, oh, that's good. And one of the points about that referendum, of course, is that I understand that the Kuomintang, the Blues, the Blue Alliance, asked its supporters not to vote for the referendum. So if he didn't get 50% vote, in good part it's because the Kuomintang supporters didn't vote for it. As you pointed out, 85% voted for it. So if they hadn't done that, it would have passed very strongly. But in any case, the Chinese then raised the question, as these demonstrations began the last week or so, about turmoil, Luan, the problem of turmoil in China, in Taiwan, and came back to a position saying that in a sense, there are two ways that China could intervene in Taiwan. One, if it declared independence unilaterally and threatened Chinese sovereignty, and two, if the Chinese people living in Taiwan, suddenly the whole system broke down and there was turmoil and people wound up fighting and killing each other, China would have the right to intervene. So that maybe got somebody nervous, or maybe not. In any case, that was something that I hadn't really myself thought about, but it came up in the press the last few days. Generally, though, the Chinese position has been low-key, and I think the point is the Chinese are trying to figure out now where can they draw the latest line in the sand. Where do they draw a line? How much further can the PRC be pushed before it has to do something for the credibility of its own policies? This is a problem. So I think that to sort of summarize the position, they're cautious. They're waiting for the recount. They want to see whether Chun has any real wish to negotiate or to get into a dialogue with the PRC, as he has suggested, although he's also suggested after the election he's all for independence. As one of you said, nobody knows what's inside Chen Shui-bian's head, and what is he driven? And is he driven by the extreme elements, in fact, in the DPP? The Chinese have to figure this out, PRC as well, because they can't get a sense of exactly where the Taiwanese will go. The Chinese also have to deal with the Hong Kong crisis and see how that will relate to Taiwan, and they also have to look at the U.S. position, whether it's going to change or not. So let's talk about the U.S. position. It's not as strongly committed to Taiwan as it was in the past. I think that's important. The Americans have a commitment to defend Taiwan. If it is attacked, they claim that commitment has been maintained. But it was very clearly stated that Chun cannot make a unilateral declaration of independence, and that the Americans prefer the status quo. That was done this past fall. They were not very pleased with the referendum, lukewarm towards it, and actually the Americans encouraged the Chinese to soften it, to water it down. The U.S. is split, I think, in Washington on its strategy at this point towards Taiwan and how to deal with China. Because while the hardliners or the pro-Taiwan position prevails among the neoconservatives, on the other hand, they've got a whole other agenda which suggests that nobody wants to rock the boat at this point, and they don't want to be pushed into a confrontation with China. Normally, we're much more aggressive in support of Taiwan's policies. Now, they don't want to jeopardize the American-China relationship, which Powell said last September are at the best level that they've been in 30 years. And of course, all that has to do with Iraq, North Korea, the war on terrorism, the trade-offs that have been made between the Americans and the Chinese to stay out of each other's backyards in order to help the Americans. Whether the Americans still need Chinese support. They need them in a number of areas. And therefore, it may well be that there's some question about how far America will go to the wall in support of Taiwan. Do the Americans want another front in an election year? I mean, there's always that. They've got enough trouble where they've committed their troops. So they did send 6 B-52s to Guam just after the election. So those of you who are military specialists, whether that's significant or not, you can decide. They took some time in recognizing Chen Shui-bian's election. They withheld judgment until they decided that finally the White House did approve, or did send congratulations. They are very, of course, eager to show support for Taiwan's democratic process, and they will support the recount. So the final 2 points that we should keep in mind: it's a U.S. election year, and therefore you can't always think rationally about what kind of policy is going to take place here and how, and you don't know what's happening in terms of the other areas where Americans are committed. And secondly, Taiwan cannot in the end exist as an autonomous state without U.S. support, as far as I can see, in its confrontation with China, and those are 2 major problems. I would say one thing about the Chinese position, which I forgot to mention, the PRC position. There's another election coming up in December, right, for the UN. It's possible that China PRC will say, well, let's give it one more try. Let's just wait until that election to see whether there will be the DPP will win completely and take over full control of the government or not. It's possible. The Canadian position, it won't take long. First, we are a non-player here, no matter how we pretend otherwise, certainly in cross-strait relations. We have nothing much to say here, and despite our substantial commitment to both the PRC and even to Taiwan, where we have a major commitment with our economic and cultural office and so forth, we strongly support a democratizing regime, and I think most of us are happy to see this, and I think that's been one of the main areas where some people would like to see Canadian policy towards Taiwan changing. How could you not support a democracy that is struggling so valiantly to emerge out of this cocoon and become something? And I think that's important. But we will, as far as I can see, and I've talked to our people, our officials recently, we will maintain the one China policy. We're not changing it. And I think that's going to be our reason why we can't ultimately be a major player here. I think there's also puzzlement as to why there's been so little coverage of this whole event, the election and its aftermath, in the Western media, in the Canadian